Okay, everybody, welcome to the Hard Sell with me, your host, Joel Stevenson. If you're joining us for the first time, selling is hard, and our goal with the show is to try to bring experience and expertise to you so you can improve your own sales results, whatever it is that you're selling and in whatever context you're selling in. So today we've got a great guest whose company is solving an age-old problem in selling, I'd say, along with, probably every other corporate or knowledge-based role. But Melanie Fellay is the co-founder and CEO of Spekit, and I'm going to have her tell you what Spekit does in a moment. And prior to Spekit, Melanie also held a number of Realty shares. We also share an investor, so I've had the pleasure of getting to know Melanie a little bit. And Melanie, it's great to have you on the show.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm super excited to be here. Really appreciate it. And yeah, it's been an exciting couple of weeks. We just announced our Series B last week, where Foundry, one of our shared investors, participated alongside some new investors. So super, super excited about what's ahead and grateful to be on the show. And happy to share a little bit about Spekit. So really what we're trying to do is just reimagine what the learning experience looks like for a typical rep or success manager joining a new company, right? I think one of the hardest parts of joining a new job is just having to learn everything about a company's industry and terminology and products and services and competitors and pricing and packaging. Like there's just so much you're expected to know from day one just to do your job. And then on top of that, you've got all these different tools and systems, and each company has them set up differently. And so it just ends up being just such a burden to try and get up to speed, which is why, folks like you and me spend so much time thinking about ramp and like, how do we scale and get, new employees really to productivity. And so where I really see the system failing at work is that most of that knowledge, most of that training that reps really need to be able to learn in their flow of work actually lives outside of their flow of work. It lives in PowerPoints. Your sales playbook is probably in a Google Doc somewhere. You've got these LMS courses that you take your first week, but that you don't go back to. And so it's not necessarily that the information doesn't exist, but it's not contextual and it's not easy to access. And so what we've created with Spekit is just a much easier way to learn, where we actually put all of that training that you need in a super bite-sized format directly within the applications you use every day, right? So if you think about doing prospecting on LinkedIn to new personas, we'll actually embed your persona cards there with like suggested messaging and what that persona cares about. If you're in Salesforce and you just got off call, maybe you're 2 months into your job and the top 2 competitors in your space, but you just got off a call where, a competitor that you recognize the name but don't know much about just came on the call. As soon as you select that value, we'll display the battle card on how you can position yourself against that competitor. So the whole idea is you really learn as you go and as these different things come up. And it's been a fun journey so far, and excited to be, hopefully bringing a little bit of that ease to work every day.
Yeah, I think you've sort of hit on a nerve here in a good way that a lot of organizations struggle with, and I would also I don't want to get into the tech here, but I think you guys have been very clever in your use of tech to be able to solve some of these problems. So congrats on all the success to date, and excited to hear more about the story. Maybe let's start though with the early part of the employee journey. I think that's sort of what you led off with. And I'm curious about what you've seen either in your customer base or maybe even when you were originally thinking of starting this company and trying to solve this problem of what percentage do you think new employees fail because they actually aren't onboarded correctly? Or because the data that they need to succeed isn't there versus they're a bad fit for a job or some other external reason?
Well, and I think that's the part that's really hard to distinguish. Is it the rep or the employee that isn't set up for success because either the resources don't exist or they're hard to find, or they don't have the right tools at their disposal? I mean, what Yesware is solving for, I actually implemented Yesware at my last company. Before Yesware, our reps were sending one-off emails, right, to do their prospecting. And so if you think about your typical rep that's worked with a sales engagement platform before, that is used to that kind of productivity, and now you're putting them in a role where they have to go back to sending one-off emails, it's going to be really hard to keep them on board. And so I think, the technology stack that you choose as an early stage company is very important, right? And like making sure that you're investing in the right technologies for the right size. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about that because at my last company, I actually led business operations. So my role was to figure out those technologies. And we had a lot of learnings because we did a lot of things wrong. And then I kind of came in and was responsible for reevaluating, what are our needs? What technologies do we need at this point in time? How do we make sure that it's an easy user experience, right? That all of our technologies work well together, that we don't have too much overlap. And I've been pretty intentional, and now our RevOps team is very intentional about doing that at Spekit too. So happy to dive into any of that.
Yeah, I'm curious about, I think particularly in technology organizations, our selling organizations also tend to have a lot of technology.
Mm-hmm.
And this isn't necessarily a show just about tech. Like this should sort of, trying to speak to all audiences here. But I think in many ways, tech is a early adopter in some of the things that, later industries, might run into as problems. Like we oftentimes see first and foremost at tech companies. So I'm curious about what you've seen in either your own experience or your customer base about like, what's the tipping point? Like, is it something like when you get, more than X number of systems, or is it certain systems that don't play well with each other, or certain systems that are too complicated? Like, what do you think are the things that result in a tech stack that's too unwieldy for somebody to actually get the benefits out of it?
Yeah, great question. So I think one, it's a tech stack that doesn't like cohesively integrate, where you're doing a lot of different activities and different tools, but like the data isn't getting passed on from one tool to the next, right? So I think it's really important that, if you think about like, I always think about the process first and then what tools help address that process. So if you think about, for example, the prospecting process, right? You're going to be doing a certain level of activity, likely in a tool like LinkedIn, if not LinkedIn, since I don't think there's really an alternative today, right? You're likely going to be using a tool that gives you contact information, right? A ZoomInfo, a Seamless, one of those. Then you're likely going to be using some level of platform to do your outreach, right? Whether that's a Yesware, an outreach, a SalesLoft, hopefully Yesware in this case. And then you're likely using a CRM where you're actually starting to manage that, at a high level and starting to look at like, okay, what converts? And you're likely using a HubSpot or a Salesforce. And so, I think it's first important to look at like, okay, what is the process that you're trying to do and what level of sophistication in that process, right? Because if you've only got one type of buyer and one type of persona, that's a very different workflow and level of capabilities that you need out of a platform where maybe HubSpot could handle your engagement needs, for example, versus, a company like ours that has multiple different segments, multiple different personas, in which case we have multiple different messaging and positioning and templates and sequencing that we're going to go try and combine, in which case, like, we really need a sophisticated platform like a Yesware. So I think before kind of picking out the tools, it's important to always start with the process first and figure out, what are we trying to accomplish with the process? Where do the different handoffs happen in the process? Either because you're trading, this is where there's a limitation, the kind of tool you're using, or because there's a handoff with another party in the organization. Like, for example, your handoff from the SDR to AE, and then starting to look at, okay, so based on this, does the current technology stack that I have meet those needs, or do you need to start going out and looking for additional tools? And I think the challenge with that is today, more and more of these platforms are taking a very, all-in-one platform approach, right? You see a lot of consolidation starting to happen, which I think in many ways is good. I think there are some arbitrary categories out there that really benefit from consolidation, but I think that's really the next challenge that most enablement and sales ops teams are going through, which is like, okay, well, now I bought all these tools and they're all coming out with competing features against each other. And so which ones should my reps use so that it doesn't become unwieldy, where like reps are using X, you can even update your opportunities using Yesware and using outreach, right? And so, but if some people are using Salesforce and some people are using Yesware, like how do you actually get, how do you set those standards and make sure that that process is cohesive? So I think it's, at the end of the day, it starts with the process and getting clear on that, and then getting really, really clear on, and here's the tool we're going to use for this part of the process, and making sure you have the right governance and training around that. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, it's been I was at one point on the other side of the table trying to, evaluate these tools for a big selling organization. I do remember that feeling of like, everybody does the same thing, or they say they do it. And so how do you actually put these tools together in such a way that they're not overlapping and people know what, sort of know which tool to do for which task, and make sure that people are sort of using them the right way I think is a huge challenge across organizations. So that definitely resonates. One thing, maybe to just drill a little bit deeper. So I think you did a nice job of laying out, what I think a lot of people would consider sort of the bare minimum sales technology stack these days. And I want to talk a little bit more about, maybe CRM specifically, where we see some CRMs that are pretty plain vanilla, and we see some CRMs that I sometimes jokingly refer to as sales ERP, because they've got, thousands of lines of Apex code and a billion things plug into them and all these integrations. And it's like, some people love creating processes in systems like that. And so, there's sort of this the both sides of the sword about like some of these systems are extremely flexible, but that can also make them very complicated. And so I'm curious, if we've traditionally had a choice between, easy to use versus like relatively sophisticated and complicated. And I'm wondering, where Spekit seems to be trying to now step into the breach a little bit, to allow you to maybe have more sophisticated processes, but also have them be somewhat easier to use. I'm just curious what you've seen in your customer base, and to the extent to which you've seen people be able to go from something that's overly complicated and not serving its purpose to something that actually is serving its purpose.
Great question. I mean, I think across the board, like especially after the last 2 years, where now everyone's remote and likely staying for the most part remote, and your need to be able to support, employees getting up to speed really on their own in many ways, has really, really put more pressure, I think more good pressure on revenue operations teams, IT teams to simplify, right? Simplify how many fields they have in an opportunity that they require, and make sure that you're only collecting, really what's the most critical to the business. Simplify how many tools you're expecting someone to use and master in their day-to-day. And, I think the challenge with technology in a platform like Salesforce, right, is that companies that have had Salesforce for like 10, 15 years that have just kept building and building and building on top, they've accumulated so much tech debt, just like, any technology that's created. I mean, Spekit's only 4 years old, and even we have tech debt that we're starting to address as a platform, right? Because we built at the time for our understanding of what was needed, and not, looking 5, 10 years ahead. And so I think with platforms like Salesforce, it's really, really hard. Like so my last company, the whole reason I got involved in this space in the first place is because our IT team had rolled out Salesforce, but there were a lot of learnings there because they didn't really involve the right business stakeholders. And so again, going back to rolling out the system, it wasn't designed around like the way we actually do business, around the process. So the actual process hadn't been thought through. And so we designed a system that really didn't map to our go-to-market, our products, our services, and our processes. And so the way it was architected and designed was not usable. And so therefore we did not get any adoption. We didn't have adequate training. And so it was a complete failure for about a year. And that's really when I stepped in and took over. And I basically went through the whole process of like unraveling. So kind of basically disconnecting, completely re-architecting it, completely re-implementing it. And that alone took me months to do, because now I had all these different fields. Some of them were filled out, some of them weren't, right? And the question is like, well, is it because we only get the data 50% of the time? Is it because people are only filling it out 50% of the time? What's the answer? It's so hard to figure out what was built and why and when. And so that's why most teams, when they inherit an org like that, they just kind of keep putting Band-Aids and building on top of that. And the end result is a slower platform in a really complex, messy platform, right? And so I think that's really where things get messy, and that's where, the necessity for a tool like Spekit becomes even more valuable, because it's all about, again, how do we help people break down the complexity and make it easier to use the platform? But I think it's hard once you get to that point, especially as an enterprise. Now, I think the good news is that, if you look at kind of what's happening in the CRM market, HubSpot has been a silent contender, but a very present one, right?
Yeah.
We're seeing it more and more in the SMB. And that's the whole thing. Like, they've got this integrated suite that has the marketing plus sales aspects, and they really approach it from a very simple angle, right? And so we're seeing a lot of these SMBs that would traditionally grow out of a platform like that and move to Salesforce say, hey, like, does HubSpot have every single advanced feature, workflow, code, customization possible like a Salesforce? No. But I think teams are starting to realize that, let's not be a special snowflake. Let's work within the confinements of what majority of companies are set up as, and not reinvent the wheel. And that's been very much our approach. Like, I built our initial tech stack. So we hired RevOps about 7 months ago. She's phenomenal. She helped scale Tableau, and so she's got a lot of really relevant experience. But when I set our tech stack up initially, like, I had Salesforce, I had a sales conversation tool. So in the first investments I made, because I wanted to be able to record my calls and understand what was going well, what wasn't, I got a sales engagement platform so that I could, like, automate some of my outreach. But I started with a very thin, very practical toolkit, but I really tried to minimize customizations to the bare minimum and really focus just on, like, how do I use as much of the out of the box functionality as possible, and then kind of expand from there. And we've really kept that discipline internally to not get into the process of just, like, our entire job is building our own internal tools. Does that make sense?
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's almost like you get the what you could almost think of as like the operations industrial complex, where it's like these complicated systems and processes start to take on a life of their own inside of your company. So I think that's a smart move. And the other thing that we're starting to see more and more of, I think, especially post-COVID, is this idea that all these CRMs were originally built under the notion of in-person first selling, and the way that data gets into the system is because the reps enter data in the system. But in a digital first world, like, all information is theoretically knowable. And so you can architect systems in a way that are a little bit different, and hopefully less prone to some of the sort of the data fidelity issues that you saw in sort of a rep specific world. And I have to laugh, like, you brought back a memory for me, which is at Wayfair, when we had invested in Salesforce initially. I think it was like, this is a little while ago, so we were on the classic version, and then like a year or later, they're sort of going around pitching Lightning. And I remember there was some executive from Salesforce was in the office sort of explaining this. We were trying to explain how a bunch of our code was going to break and it was going to be a problem. And I eventually came to the realization that the thing that Salesforce was launched on, like the no software, like the software with the line through it thing, and like the no upgrades, and like they were basically forcing all their customers through an enterprise upgrade process, which I think really just proves your point that all these things, whether you like it or not, carry some level of maintenance and tech debt. And if you can be smart about simplifying that, that's a big benefit. Melanie, maybe just switching subjects here briefly again. I think sometimes people wonder about how do you justify the investment in learning and development, and so in part of, I think, what you guys are trying to solve for is like the knowledge gap that prevents people from being successful. And so when you talk to customers about making investments in this area, like what are some of the areas that shows up? Is it sort of like time to productivity or ramp or turnover? Like what are some of the metrics that you feel like you're able to move with an investment like Spekit?
Yeah, great question. I mean, onboarding, like time to ramp, is definitely the most obvious, because at the end of the day, like, we remove the need for, a new sales rep to memorize everything about their job from day one, which we know is just fundamentally not how we learn as humans, right? We're very contextual. People are very like, the way that our consumer technology has set our expectations of just everything is when you need it, right? Oh, I need something on Amazon, one click. Oh, I need a car, Uber, one click, right? Oh, I need groceries, DoorDash. Like, we're so used to that instant gratification, like when I need it, I get it, that, at work, I think one of the hardest parts is that like that is just completely different. And so we're really trying to close that gap and just say like, hey, when you're going through a process for the first time, or when you're going through a process for the first time since it was changed, or when you're learning a new job and you're trying to memorize all the different fields. I mean, think about just your opportunity record in Salesforce. Think about how many custom fields and acronyms, and the way that Yesware wants their reps filling out close date and amount is different than they might have used at their last company. Like, there's so much of that business knowledge that is deeply integrated within your systems. And so we remove the pain of having to just memorize that or learn that painfully on your own by putting all that content right when and where you need it. And so time to ramp is a clear one. Day-to-day productivity as well, especially when it comes to, a lot of companies are putting on trainings for every change that happens in Salesforce, or you're sending out newsletters that people aren't reading because that change doesn't impact them until, 4 weeks from now when they go do the process. But then when the rep does go do it, they're frustrated, they're pinging Slack in a group channel and sales ops, and everyone's getting distracted. Like, all those things come from just people just not knowing what they need to do. And so we remove a lot of that friction that not only causes just like wasted time across often multiple parties, but just a lot of frustration as well. And going back to your question on turnover, at the end of the day, like, do I think Spekit directly impacts turnover? I think that's a really, really hard kind of stretch of a metric to say, but there's a lot of studies and data that shows that your retention is directly correlated to the onboarding experience that someone has at your company, right? And so similar to kind of like the stats that you read about, hey, the success of a customer rollout within, buying your product is directly correlated to their own onboarding and how fast they onboard and roll out. I think the same happens for employees. And data shows, in fact, that the easier you make it to onboard employees. Hello? Oh, can you hear me?
Melanie, I can still hear you.
Okay, great. Sorry, I think there was a little bit. I just got a notification. But did that answer your question?
Yeah, it did, and I guess the quick follow up to that is, particularly as you talk about onboarding. I mean, we used to onboard reps in person in classes and cohorts, and we haven't really been able to do that much for the last 2 years, and maybe that'll just become the new normal. And so I imagine, it's probably harder than ever to achieve a successful onboarding process without investing in some tools like a Spekit. Is that fair to say?
So the way I kind of put it in perspective is like the difference between like companies that use a Slack or team strategy plus email are the ones that rely strictly on email. Like, can you get by in 2022 with using email only as your internal communications strategy? Probably. Right? But is that the most efficient way to communicate about topics? I mean, can you imagine right now if you didn't have channels in Slack? I mean, I imagine, yes, there was a Slack customer or Teams. Are you guys one of the two?
Yes, we have a robust, we have thousands of custom emojis just to tell you how invested we are in Slack.
Exactly, right? So can you imagine trying to run your company today without channels, without direct messages, without all the collaboration? Even now we have customer channels within our Slack, right? The idea of operating without this new way of collaborating and communicating, especially remote, feels almost impossible. Yet there are still some companies that get by with email only, though I'd be willing to bet that they're not nearly as productive in some aspects that companies that do use Slack. I think the same way with a Spekit versus your typical onboarding. Like, can a company get by just using Google Docs for training and PowerPoints? Probably. But at the end of the day, like, you are missing out on all the benefits that come to an employee being able to just learn as they go, right? And when you're a rep, and I really do think that this is kind of the future, like as there's been so much turnover with the Great Resignation, people have been switching jobs left and right. We had a BDR go through our internship program, and then she got offered a BDR job at a large enterprise, is what I'll share, that we all know. And she went there, and literally within months, she's like, is there any chance you guys have a BDR opening full time here? Because I can't operate here, because this company she joined, they had basically like an intranet where all the information lived, but she was like, everything was out of date. She couldn't find everything. It was just painful. She's like, my manager doesn't know where the answers are. I can't get time on their calendar. Like, she was just a number. Whereas like we were, she got used to having Spekit, which was like, hey, when she's in LinkedIn, she has her persona cards. When she's in, Salesforce, she has every single process, every single enablement. Her sales playbook is instantly available. She was able to be so self-sufficient. And so when you think about like that as a retention and traction tool, like I think as reps go through those experiences and they realize like, oh, wow, like my onboarding experience and like this company is really setting me up for success in a different way, I think they'll start asking that interview questions like, hey, how are you going to make me successful remote? Like, talk to me about what technologies are available to me for me to hit my number, and talk to me about what technologies are available to help me be successful in this remote role. And the companies, like once a rep is used to that ease of a Yesware versus typical email, or used to the ease of a Spekit versus your traditional LMS or PowerPoint, I think it's really hard to turn back.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I agree. I would even maybe go one step further to say that a lot of this stuff increasingly shows up in places like Glassdoor as well. And so if you're providing bad experiences, not only could it be just one person leaving, but you then may have a residual effect of like every person that researches your company now sees this note about the person that failed because the information was all over the place and it wasn't clear, and
Yeah. And I think the pressure is significantly elevated for technology companies, right? Especially high growth, innovative startups. Like, how can you possibly expect like your sales team, your go-to-market teams to be pushing innovation and, sending that message out to your customers, but then, give them tools that literally are decades old to use to be successful in their own roles, right? There's a certain like incongruence there that I think is really hard to push forward. Just like for us, like I want our internal, like our enablement mandate internally is like, I want our enablement program at Spekit to be the best enablement program that any employee has experienced at any company they've ever worked at, right? Because we can't be preaching the message to the world of like, hey, like training is important, investing in your team, learning is the way of the future, and like sending that message and really selling the importance of that, which I wholeheartedly and frankly our team wholeheartedly believes in, but then not hold ourselves to those standards internally as well. So we place a lot of investment in our own kind of learning and training internally as well.
Yeah, right. That makes sense. Yeah, I imagine the internal team is held to a relatively high standard there, and they've got a lot of eyes on them. But I think based on what you've done so far, they're doing well.
Yeah, and we're actually going through we called it the Spekit Glam Up project, because I'm sure Yesware is similar. When you run a technology company, you're when you have the benefit, I guess, of being a user of your own technology. Like, we were our first users, so we've got what we call a spec, which is essentially a piece of training or a knowledge article from 2018 when it was just me and my co-founder. And so at the time we weren't thinking about we're going to be 150 people in 2 years, so let's make sure we have the right architecture and setup. No, we were just kind of building here and there. And so frankly, our own Spekit account became unruly. Like, what we were preaching to our customers, we weren't following internally, and we had to go through a cleanup effort. And so we made it I made it a company-wide initiative. We, put a committee together. I'm like, I want us to go and clean up our current org and reset and make sure that moving forward, we can really, really be proud of the way that we've set it up. And I'm surprised at how few companies kind of make that a priority within their own use of their technology.
Yeah,
but you learn a lot in the process.
Yeah, it's like the cobblers. They're the shoemaker's children, right? That have bad shoes. It's like you do definitely see that out in the world. So, well, Melanie, I think we could probably speak for several hours on these subjects. I think, but we're starting to run out of time here. So I I'm just going to check and see if anybody in the audience has any questions. And while people are queuing up, if there is anything, why don't you just let us know if people want to be in touch or learn more about you and or Spekit, what are the best ways to do that?
Yeah, absolutely. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn, Melanie Fellay. Always looking forward to connecting with folks. And then feel free to check out our website, spekit.com, SPEKIT.com. Thank you so much.
Okay. Great, Melanie. Well, it was really nice having you on the show, and hope to speak with you again soon.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.